So, Déjà vu, another water bond, and another. This session is called Déjà vu, as once again voters will be confronted with not one, but two multi-billion-dollar propositions this year dealing with water. One of which will be on the June 5th ballot, and another one coming up in November. This comes as $7+ billion from Prop 1 that was passed in 2014, still sits waiting to be allocated. Leading this discussion is someone that many of you check in on regularly. Her notebook is a go-to blog for the latest news in California water dealings. She is water maven Chris Austin. Today, yes, give her a round of applause. Today, Ms. Austin will talk to the author of the November measure, an $8.9 billion measure for the improvements of California's water quality systems, watersheds, and protection of natural habitats, Dr. Jerry Meral of the National Heritage Institute. Welcome him. Additionally, we have on stage Joseph Byrne, who was appointed by Governor Brown to the California Water Commission in 2012. The California Water Commission is the state entity in charge of distributing public dollars for water projects and regulations. Joseph is here to give us an update on the Prop 1 money that the state still has in the bank. So I'm going to hand over this discussion to Ms. Austin, the water maven. Chris.
Fritz. So we're the last session between you and lunch, but we're going to talk about money, so that ought to make it popular. Next Tuesday, voters are going to head to the polls to vote on a number of things, one of those being Prop 68, which would authorize $4 billion in general obligation bonds for state and local parks, environmental protection and restoration projects, water infrastructure projects, and flood protection projects. And the measure does require a portion of the funding to be dedicated to disadvantaged communities and park-poor neighborhoods. The measure has wide support from Governor Brown and a number of legislators and numerous organizations. Not a whole lot of opposition, most notably the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association and the OC Register and the California Water Alliance, which is in the San Joaquin Valley. But we'll see what the voters have to say on Tuesday. But it's not the end yet for water bonds. More money may be on the way, because already slated for the November ballot is another water bond measure, the Water and Supply Water Quality Act of 2018. We have with us Dr. Jerry Meral with the National Heritage Institute to tell us more about that. And I just have to add that Jerry Meral and I go way, way back. He's now with the National Heritage Institute, but as you probably remember, he used to be with the state. And we spent many, many hours in some really stuffy conference rooms getting hammered on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And I will tell you that this man sat there at that table, and he would not take a break. And those meetings would go 3 to 4 hours, and he would sit there, and people would yell at him, and they could go on for as long as they wanted. And when they finished, he'd be like, well, in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next agenda item. But as an old lady, I'm jealous that you could sit there for that long. Okay, but meanwhile, tell us about your November water bond.
Thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here today in Orange County, and I really appreciate the invitation to tell you about this water bond. I guess this must be my magic formula. You're going to be hearing quite a bit from Joe Byrne about Proposition 1, but suffice it to say that the funds in Proposition 1 are moving through the process. And in fact, I believe by the end of next year, all of those funds will be allocated by the legislature to agencies, and most of the funds will be allocated out to districts such as the ones that many of you represent. So Proposition 1 is moving along the way the legislature and the voters intended, and I think its purposes will be fulfilled. The differences between our measure and Prop 1 is that the very difficult language that was given to the Water Commission is not included in our measure. We make it much simpler for people to apply for funding for a variety of programs. I'll talk about those in a minute. And we didn't have to go through that difficult process. Also, the money is appropriated directly to the state agencies for grants to local agencies. It does not have to go through the legislature or the budget process. It's approved by the people and will be available right after that. And finally, we use existing guidelines for the existing programs, and so there's not a lot of extra bureaucracy as well. Prop 68 that Chris mentioned is a measure on the ballot in June. It does have a water element. It's primarily an urban parks measure, and that's what the legislature intended. It does include some water elements. Where it does include water elements, they overlap with ours only in a very small way and in a positive way. So, for example, the Salton Sea, which many of you are familiar with, we have to restore that sea, avoid the dust problem, and both measures fund that program, for example. People always ask, can we afford new bonds? And this is from your voter handbook. You've undoubtedly taken it out and studied it carefully. And here's a chart from the voter handbook that shows how much debt the state has and how much we invest in repaying general obligation bonds. And we're fortunate that we're only now, even if Proposition 68 passes, we're only now using less than 4% of the state's general fund to pay off general obligation bonds. And that's considered by the bond community very conservative. They'd like us to stay below 6%. And that's for two reasons. One is the governor has not approved a lot of bonds. He's rather frugal, as we all know. And also the state's general fund is in really excellent condition. And so our bond rating is just about as high as it's been in the last 10 years. So we are in a position financially and fiscally to approve new bonds. What would Orange County get out of this measure? The programs that the previous speaker from San Diego was describing are well funded by this measure. And the goal is to give incentives to local districts to undertake projects that they might find that they don't quite have enough money for. The state very rarely provides all the funding for a project, but the state does provide sort of incremental funding, up to half perhaps, to help make good projects go forward. That is the goal of this measure. And so categories that are included in the bond will provide direct grants to agencies like the ones many of you represent. Wastewater recycling, $400 million. Groundwater desal, which we heard the previous speaker mention, and very popular in Southern California. Water conservation in urban areas, something that we have to continue doing. Repairing flood control reservoirs. We have several reservoirs in Southern California that cannot be managed for water supply because they're not safe with respect to their flood control function. So we have to fix those reservoirs and allow more storage. Stormwater management, a very demanding program, a great need for funding, and that's something we also fund. And right along the Santa Ana River, a watershed improvement program by the Coastal Conservancy of $30 million. There's some other programs that I think are really important in Orange County. The NCCP program that many of you are familiar with, Natural Community Conservation Plans, $60 million. I mentioned the Salton Sea. That's a critical project that has to be completed. We cannot have massive dust storms coming out of the Salton Sea. Repairing, using urban streams, repairing their watersheds. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. It does not just apply to the San Joaquin Valley. It's important throughout Southern California, a mandate by the legislature that we've got to fulfill, manage our groundwater basins better. Fixing the Oroville Dam, that has an impact on your water rates directly because you're all presumably customers of MWD in one way or the other. So that allocation is important to your water rates. The Delta Fisheries Restoration Program is designed to restore Delta fisheries and reduce pressure on exports. The goal has to be bring those populations back and have less restrictions on exports, which has a direct effect on your water supply. And finally, repairing the Sierra Nevada watershed, which has been hammered by fires and a lot of other problems, drought, dead trees. That's impairing the quality and quantity of the water you use here in Orange County, has to be fixed. There are other important categories: safe drinking water, agricultural water conservation, mainly in the San Joaquin Valley, and fixing the Friant Kern Canal, a vital piece of California's infrastructure. We estimate, and I apologize to the gentleman who said all slides should be readable, we estimate that this measure will produce 1.5 million acre-feet of new water. I'm not going to go through all these categories. That's enough for 3 million households, matching California's growth needs. This is a list of every water bond that's been presented to the voters in the last 40 years. 23 out of 24 have passed. So we're fortunate that the voters understand the need for water bonds, and we hope that they'll approve Prop 68 and certainly our measure as well. One of the best parts about this measure is the broad support that it has. The California Chamber of Commerce, California Business Properties, California Building Industry Association, numerous local groups like BizFed, VICA, many of you know those groups in LA County, are endorsing this measure. We're very proud of our business support. Conservation groups are supporting this. We have over 70 responsible conservation groups supporting our efforts. We have Aqua, which endorsed us very early. The agricultural community has been tremendously helpful and have provided much of the funding and the endorsements. And finally, the environmental justice groups, because they care about safe drinking water. Can we pass this? This is a bar chart showing our polling, 61% initially, 68% once people hear the message. So we are optimistic and we don't expect any funded opposition. What do we need? We need your districts, your water districts to endorse this measure. You're the single best endorsement that we have. People trust you. You have a good water supply, high quality, reasonable rates. If you say vote for this, our chances go up. So if you represent a water district, please consider an endorsement of our measure. Thank you.
The clock is brutal.
Okay, Joe, you're with the Water Commission. Why don't you give us an update on where you are with spending the Prop 1 funds?
All right, just happy to do so. Make sure I get this right. Got some notes with me. Okay, well, thank you for having me here today as well. I'm here to talk about the California Water Commission and our water storage investment program. You know, I was preparing this morning at my breakfast room table with my 11-year-old daughter next to me, and she said, "What are you doing, Daddy?" I said, "Well, I'm preparing for a talk." She said, "About what?" I said, "About water." She goes, "Always water, always water, always water." And then I started telling her, she goes, "What's it about?" She's pretty inquisitive, so I told her a little bit about it. And she goes, "You know, it's really boring, Daddy." And I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "You ought to try to turn it into a rap." So I'm not sure I'm going to do that. I said it probably wasn't the crowd in the history of these talks. I'm not sure anyone has rapped in front of the water community, so I'll spare you me doing that now. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to just give you an update on the California Water Commission and what we're doing. We've been in the press a little bit more lately, some positive, some negative. For background purposes, there are 8 current members of the Water Commission, and we have a variety of responsibilities, the most significant of which is to spend the $2.7 billion that are in Prop 1, Chapter 8 for the Water Storage Investment Program. We're authorized to spend money on public benefits associated with water storage projects. I'll get into that. Qualifying projects are surface water projects, groundwater storage projects, conjunctive use, and local and regional surface storage projects. So Jerry gave me a great lead-in when he used the word convoluted and difficult. The statute of which we're operating under is very challenging. It's not your typical program. We're doing our meetings and evaluating projects in public. There are very strict criteria of which applicants have had to comply with. Applications have been very complicated, I'm assuming very expensive as well. So we've really been dealing with a lot of challenges, and it's really a new kind of effort, and I think it is a result of compromise between folks who really wanted, in particular, surface water storage, and folks who particularly didn't want surface water storage, who came together to pass this legislation back in 2009. So again, back to what we're allowed to fund. We're allowed to fund the public benefits associated with water storage projects. It's very counterintuitive. Not included in those public benefits is water supply. So we're allowed to fund ecosystem improvements, water quality improvements, recreational purposes, emergency response benefits, and flood control benefits. So when I explain this, and I think I've explained it to a number of people in the crowd before, folks submit their application. In their application, they tell us all the good things that they're going to do for the environment, for flood control, for recreation, for water quality. And in our process, we evaluate that through technical studies and essentially attach a value to that. So the value that we're paying, even though we're technically paying for a water storage project, we're paying money for them to also do, or primarily do the things that they say they're going to do for the environment. So another restriction is 50% of the funds that we spend need to go towards ecosystem improvements. And also there needs to be a demonstrable or measurable benefit to the delta or its tributaries. So it's focused primarily on the delta. Okay, I'll get through quickly here. Okay, we also have a role to play. The Department of Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Resources Control Board are kind of our partners in this. Fish and Wildlife and the board established the environmental and water quality priorities, which are in our regulations that we adopted, and they played a very critical role and are continuing to, pursuant to the Act, in the evaluation of these projects. So where are we? We started with 11 projects. We're down to 8. 3 were determined to be ineligible. Of the original 11, 6 were surface storage projects, 5 were groundwater projects. We now have 4 components of how we're going to score them. So what happens is we've determined one component of the score already, which is the public benefit ratio, which is the maximum eligibility amount and the benefits that are going to be provided in the minds of us, staff originally, and now us. And the way I like to explain that is we had hearings in May, and all the applicants came forward, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, what they did is they looked at the environmental benefits that were being claimed, and they determined whether they felt those environmental benefits were actually going to be happening or not, or able to happen or not. And then we had economists who would then monetize those and put a value on them. So we had a lot of back and forth. The Commission's role was to evaluate the work of staff as well as to listen to applicants. And we had a lot of back and forth, and were able to adjust some of those scores based upon the Commission's discretion, and in most cases elevated the amounts that certain people were eligible to receive. Certain folks did not receive what they wanted to, but a number of projects, I believe, did. At this stage, so we've established the public benefit ratios. We're having a meeting later this month. Staff earlier last week released the scores for the other 3 components, which are the relative environmental value. Going back to Fish and Wildlife and State Water Resources Control Board, they've established their priorities, which are in our regulations. So they're looking at the benefits and whether they hit those priorities. Folks who hit those priorities more are going to get a higher score. Resiliency is another component, and then implementation risk of whether you actually have a feasible project, do you have the financing, et cetera. So that meeting will take place at the end of June. It's a 3-day meeting, and the Commission has an opportunity to again look at staff and what they proposed, to listen to the applicants and what their arguments are, and make adjustments to those scores, of which then, or direct staff to look into something in more detail and come back to us, with the thought that in July we'll have another meeting in which we'll make final eligibility determinations. So that's essentially the point in which we'll say, based upon your application, we believe that you qualify for this amount, and then we'll move forward with executing a contract to that effect, and there's a number of steps after that in the implementation of these projects. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so you all start thinking up your questions. I don't have a lot of them here. Okay, Jerry, I want to start with you. We just heard from Joe that there's this very complicated evaluation projects for the water storage projects for Prop 1 that was intended to make sure that water storage projects had the benefits that the state or legislator wanted to see. With your water bond, do you have a method in there? I mean, what projects would qualify, and is there a method or a way you have that the best water storage projects would float to the top somehow? How would you determine that?
We believe in drafting this measure that water supply, groundwater recharge, and other forms of water management are in fact a public benefit. So every project that does those things, in addition to reclaiming wastewater, water conservation, things like that. So we don't put our projects in this bond act through that kind of complicated test. If they can show a water supply benefit, if they can show groundwater recharge, water conservation, they'll be eligible and they won't have to go through that difficult process.
Another thing that you noted is that your bond would help out with the subsidence on the Bryant-Kern Canal. There would be people that would say that the people that caused that subsidence should be responsible for repairing that aqueduct, not the taxpayers. What would you say to that?
Well, the Bryant-Kern Canal serves over 1 million of the best farmland acres in the world, actually, and there's 15,000 separate farms. A lot of the subsidence was not caused by members of the Bryant-Kern service area. It was caused by people who developed groundwater supplies for almonds and other crops outside of the Bryant-Kern. But their groundwater overdraft, in part, resulted in the subsidence of the canal. There's no way to go after them and say, you must pay for part of repairing the canal. And in fact, it wouldn't really directly benefit them anyway. To avoid that complicated process, we said this is one of California's most important pieces of water infrastructure. We've got to get it fixed. It's restricting our ability to recharge groundwater. Let's just get it done.
Okay, and one last question for you. How is your November bond different from the one that we're voting on next week? I think you touched on it a little bit.
There's about an 18% overlap, and the major areas are safe drinking water, wastewater recycling, and especially the Salton Sea, and flood control in the Central Valley. All of those have a huge unfunded need, far in excess of the combination of the two measures, and so we're not thinking there's any conflict. In fact, we think they're complementary.
Okay, great. And are you thinking of questions out there? Joe, I have a question for you. What can you tell us about the current outstanding debt that the state has from past water and non-water bond measures?
I would refer to Jerry's helpful slide.
Well, the total state debt for all GO bonds is $83 billion, but of course we pay that off over a very large number of years. And so the fact that we only spend less than 4% of our general fund to pay the principal and interest shows we're being pretty responsible with our bonds. Our state budget is well in excess of $100 billion, so we're still in the conservative range.
Yeah, I think that the numbers are scary because the population is very high and they hear billions, but really billions spread over the population is not that much.
Right.
So do we have any questions out there? No questions?
I see one right there.
Oh, excellent.
Thank you for a very good session. I'm Chuck Gibson of the Santa Margarita Water District. There is, this is for regards Prop 1 and the Bond Accountability website. I went to the Bond Accountability website and it looks like the funds are committed. Can you explain to me what it means that funds are committed when they haven't been allocated yet?
Sure. Yeah, they're not yet committed. The maximum eligibility amount is what has been determined as part of the public benefit ratio. So the applications that are in right now, the numbers that you see attached to them, they can receive no more than that amount, which is why that was an important meeting back in May. It set the ceiling for projects. And then this next component in the meeting in July will be scoring based upon resiliency, implementation, risk, and then they'll get a final score, and they'll be put into one of three categories. The first category would be funded first, the second category second, and third category third. Right now, in staff recommendation, I think it's 4 categories in Category 2 and 4 categories in Category 3. So the next determination will be, in July would be the final decision on the projects.
Right, and so some of those projects will help increase the storage capacity as the state water project gets more efficient through the water fix, correct?
Correct. I mean, there's a lot of variety of projects with a variety of storage capacity, and we've encouraged them all to think about how they can be integrated into the system. In fact, that's one of the components of the resiliency part of the score is how does it integrate and benefit the state system overall.
Okay, thank you very much.
I might add one thing, please.
Sure, absolutely.
The gentleman referred to the water fix, and some of these projects that the Commission is considering funding really would be enhanced if the water fix goes ahead, and so certainly I know all of you are in support of that, and it would help make those projects more efficient.
Right. Do we have another question? Oh no, crickets. Okay. Do you think it's too soon for another water bond? Do you think the voters are going to go for another big water bond after they vote on this $4 billion one on Tuesday?
Remarkably, we've had a water bond every 2.5 years since 1972, and at times we've had 2 and once even 3 water bonds in the same year. That hasn't stopped the voters from voting for this. As I showed, 23 out of 24 have been approved. So I think when they see that they're complementary and serve somewhat different purposes, we'll be okay.
Okay, great. No more questions? Okay, Joe, you have 8 projects left. What's the split between surface storage and groundwater on those remaining 8 projects?
Good question. Let me see. It might be 4-4. 4 and 4. Yeah. the Chino Basin Groundwater Storage Project, Kern Fan Groundwater Storage Project, these are groundwater ones, Willow Springs Water Bank, and the Sac Regional Groundwater Storage and Conjunctive Use. On the surface storage, Los Vaqueros, Pacheco, Sites, and Temperance.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, a lot of good projects, good worthy projects in there in that mix. With Sigma implementation coming on, a lot of interest in getting water in for groundwater recharge. So some of those projects will be good. Well, I think it looks like we're out of time. So Chris will tell us what's next.
Thank you so much, Water Maven. Thank you, gentlemen. That was really wonderful.